Okay, picture this scenario. It's the dream, right? You've worked your entire life.
Mm.
You scrape together the down payment. You finally buy the house. Maybe it's not a mansion. Maybe it's a bit of a fixer-upper, but it is yours.
It's your safety net. It's that foundation of personal security.
Mm.
Owning a piece of the earth, it gives you a place to stand.
Exactly. And it's the only thing standing between you and, a chaotic world. You know the mail carrier by name. You planted those hydrangeas out front. You've got the height marks of your kids on the doorframe.
It's the American dream in a nutshell.
Right. And then one random Tuesday morning, you get a letter. It's on that official heavy stock letterhead, and it says, "We need your house."
Oof.
And not because you did anything wrong, not because you didn't pay your taxes, but simply because the city council had some meeting you didn't even know about, and they decided they have a better idea for your land than you do.
Maybe a road, maybe a shopping mall.
Could be anything, but the result is always the same. You have to leave.
That is the nightmare scenario. And it triggers a very primal fear, the fear that what we think is ours isn't actually ours if the state decides otherwise.
It's you.
Just shakes your whole sense of stability.
Or take another one. You buy a beautiful plot of land near the coast. You're planning to build that retirement cottage you've always talked about.
Mhm.
You close the deal. You transfer the money. And the very next day, the state legislature passes a new law that says, actually, to protect the view, no building is allowed here ever.
And just like that, your investment is worth basically zero.
You still own the land, sure, you can go have a picnic on it, but you can never build your home. And suddenly you're paying property taxes on a glorified picnic spot.
It's devastating.
Precisely. And that is what we are diving into today. We are looking at the ultimate showdown. Your stuff versus the state. We're talking about constitutional protections for your property and your contract right.
I know. The minute you say constitutional law, people's eyes glaze over.
I can hear the listeners groaning already. Oh, great, a lecture. It sounds like the driest, dustiest topic imaginable.
It's so often taught that way, which is a real tragedy. Because in reality, this is the operating system for your life. It defines the boundary line between your personal freedom and government power.
That's a great way to put it.
If you own a car, a house, a business, or even just a bank account, these rules, these cases we're going to talk about, they determine whether you actually get to keep them. It's quite literally the difference between ownership and just renting from the government.
So our mission today is simple. We're going to take this stack of dense legal texts, and we have a lot of them here, covering everything from the Fifth Amendment to something called exactions, and we are going to decode all of that legal jargon.
We're going to be looking at the Takings Clause, the Due Process Clause, and contract rights.
And we should make a promise right here at the top.
Let's do it.
Lawyers love to use Latin and complicated phrasing to make simple concepts sound difficult. We're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to translate things like eminent domain, regulatory takings, and ex post facto into plain, simple English.
Zero legalese. That's the promise. If we use a fancy word, we will stop and explain it immediately.
I love that. So here's our roadmap for the hour. First, we have to figure out what property actually is because, spoiler alert, it's weirdly specific and it's not always what you think. Then we'll talk about when the government can just take it using eminent domain. Then we get into the really gray areas. What happens when they don't take your land, but they pass a law that makes it worthless? That's a regulatory taking.
And we'll also cover some of those scary-sounding laws the government is absolutely forbidden from passing, like laws that punish you for something that wasn't illegal when you did it.
Spooky. All right, let's jump right in. Section 1, the basics. What actually counts as your property? Because, I look at my phone, I look at my house, that feels like property. But the law sees it a little differently.
So we have to start with the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Most people know the Fifth for pleading the Fifth, that right to remain silent so you don't incriminate yourself.
Right.
But there's another clause in there, tucked away at the very end, called the Takings Clause. And it says, private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation.
Okay, let's stop and unpack that right away. It sounds like the Constitution is just admitting right up front that the government can take your stuff.
Correct. And that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. That power is called eminent domain. It's the government's inherent power as a sovereign nation to take private property.
So the Constitution doesn't give them that power.
No. It assumes the government already has it, because basically all governments have it. The Fifth Amendment is a check on that power. It says, fine, you can take it, but you have to open your wallet. You have to pay for it.
Just compensation. That's the price tag on tyranny, basically.
In a way, yes. It turns a seizure into a forced sale. You don't get a choice in selling, but you do get a check. But here is the first major catch. To even complain about a taking, you have to have a valid property interest.
What does that mean exactly?
It means you can't sue the government for taking something if you didn't actually own the specific right they took in the first place.
This brings us to that bundle of sticks analogy, right? I remember this vaguely from a college class, but walk me through it again because I think it helps visualize everything.
It's absolutely the single best way to visualize property law. Imagine your property isn't one solid thing like a rock you hold in your hand.
Okay.
Imagine it's a bundle of sticks all tied together with a string. Each stick represents a different right you have. One stick is the right to sell the land. Another stick is the right to build a house on it. Another is the right to keep people off it, the right to exclude.
So I can hold on to some sticks but give other ones away.
Exactly. You can own the land but sell the mineral rights stick to an oil company. Now they own whatever's underground, and you just own the surface. Or you can sell the air rights stick to a developer who wants to build a bridge over your land. You still own the ground.
So if the government comes along and takes a stick that you already sold or one you never had in your bundle to begin with,
Then they don't owe you a dime. Precisely. And this gets really, really tricky in real life. It's not always obvious which sticks you're holding.
which brings us to a fascinating case. Stop the Beach Renourishment v. Florida.
Yes. And whenever you see a case involving beachfront property, you know the stakes are high
Right.
because that land is so valuable.
Of course.
So here's the scene. You have these homeowners living right on the beach in Florida. It's the dream life. Their property line went all the way to the water. Specifically, under Florida law, they owned the dry sand down to the mean high water line.
So basically, where the wet sand starts, their property ends. They can walk out their back door, cross their own private sand, and hit the ocean.
Right. And in Florida, the state owns all the submerged land under the water. The homeowners own the dry sand. Now, the government decides the beach is eroding, it's washing away.
The common problem.
So they come in and dredge up a ton of sand from the ocean floor and dump it on the beach. They create this brand new, really wide strip of dry sand between the homeowner's old property line and the new water line.
Ah, so suddenly, the homeowners are not beachfront anymore. There's this new strip of public beach between their house and the ocean.
Exactly. And because it's public land, the public can now walk all over that new sand. So the homeowners sued. They said, you took our waterfront rights. We used to touch the water. Now we touch public sand. And we lost our right to keep people from walking in front of our house.
They wanted to use that right to exclude stick from their bundle. That private access is a huge part of the value.
A huge part. But the Supreme Court said no taking. And here's why. Under Florida's common law, these ancient judge-made rules of property, if the state creates new land by filling in the water, a process called avulsion, that new land belongs to the state.
So they never owned the future sand.
They never had a stick in their bundle that said, I own any new land the government might build in front of my house.
Yeah.
So because they didn't have that specific property interest to begin with, legally, nothing was taken from them.
That is wild. I mean, they felt like they lost something huge. That direct ocean access is why you buy the house. But legally, they lost nothing they ever officially owned.
It just highlights how important it is to know exactly what's in your bundle. And property isn't just dirt and houses. It includes personal property, like your car, but it also includes intangible
Or
property.
tangible. So
Yeah.
stuff you can't touch, like ideas or contracts.
Yes. Patents, trade secrets, contract rights. Let's do a hypothetical to make it really concrete. Imagine you invent the world's best recipe for a new energy soda. It's a trade secret you haven't told a soul.
I'm keeping it in a vault. This is the new Coca-Cola formula.
Right. If the government comes in and seizes that formula to give to the army because it makes soldiers run faster, that is a taking. They have to pay you for that secret recipe, just as if they had taken your house. Your idea, in that context, is property.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's do a quick recap for Section 1 before we move on. This is really the crucial foundation for everything else.
Let's do it. So first, the government can take your stuff. That power is eminent domain.
But number 2, under the Fifth Amendment, they have to pay just compensation.
Third, and this is the key, you only get paid if you can prove you actually owned the specific right, the specific stick that they took.
And fourth, if the law says you never owned it in the first place, like that new sand in Florida, you get 0. You have to hold the stick to get paid for the stick.
Perfect summary.
All right, now let's move to Section 2. Sometimes the government takes things in sneakier ways. They don't drive a bulldozer onto your lawn with a big property of the USA flag. They just mess with your rights so much it counts as a taking.
These are often the most heartbreaking cases because the owner doesn't see it coming. Let's talk about inheritance rights. This is the case of Hodel v. Irving. It involves Native American tribal land, and it's really a story about bureaucracy gone completely off the rails.
Set the scene for us. This has to do with how land was split up over generations, right?
Yes. In the late 19th century, the government allotted tribal lands to individual Native Americans. But over the generations, those lands were split up among heirs again and again and again.
So if a father had 4 kids, the land gets split 4 ways. Then each of those kids has kids.
And exponential math just takes over. You fast forward a few generations, and it got to the point where a single piece of land might have hundreds of owners, each owning a tiny, tiny fraction like 2% of 1 acre.
It must have been a bureaucratic nightmare to manage.
A total nightmare. I mean, the administrative costs of just tracking who owned 0.001% of a field cost more than the field was actually worth.
So Congress decided to fix it. And usually when Congress steps in to fix something complicated, somebody loses out.
They sure did. They passed a law that essentially said, this is ridiculous. If a piece of land is too small, if it generates less than a certain amount of income per year, you cannot leave it to your kids in your will. When you die, it vanishes from your family and goes back to the tribe. The legal term is escheat.
So the government basically said, your slice of the pie is too small for us to care about, so we're just taking it back when you die. Sorry, your kids get nothing.
And the Supreme Court stopped them cold.
Right.
They ruled that the right to pass your property to your heirs is one of the most fundamental sticks in the entire property bundle. It goes back to the very concept of ownership in Western law.
I mean, if you can't give it away when you die, do you really own it?
That was the court's point, exactly. They said you cannot just abolish the right to inheritance completely, even for these tiny pieces of land. That is an unconstitutional taking. They have to pay for it.
That's a relief. You can't just delete ownership because it's inconvenient for the bureaucracy. Now, what about when the government doesn't touch your land at all, but they mess up the environment right around it? I'm thinking of the air above it. This is the Griggs case.
Griggs v. Allegheny County. Oh, this is a classic. The government built an airport near Pittsburgh, and the runway ended right near Mr. Griggs' house. Now, to be clear, they didn't take any of his land. They didn't touch his house. The surveyors never crossed his property line.
I'm guessing planes are not silent.
Not at all. We're talking about planes taking off and landing constantly, flying extremely low over his roof.
So windows rattling, plaster falling from the ceiling, you can't sleep, you can't have a conversation, the kind of noise that just drives you insane.
Precisely that. The government argued, hey, we're in the air. We're not on your land. The sky is free for navigation. We didn't touch your dirt.
And the court said,
Absolutely not. This is a taking. The noise and the vibration made a property virtually unusable as a residence. They invaded his airspace so aggressively that it was the functional equivalent of seizing the land itself.
so you own the dirt, and you also own the immediate air you need to actually use and enjoy the dirt.
Correct. They effectively took what's called an easement of flight. They turned his house into part of the runway approach. If they make your house uninhabitable, they bought it.
But let's clarify something here, because I don't want listeners thinking that any loss of rights is automatically a taking. There's a big difference between the government taking your right and you losing your right because you were, well, lazy.
This is the use it or lose it rule, and it comes from a case called Texaco, Inc. v. Short, a very important distinction.
What happened there?
The state of Indiana passed a law saying if you own mineral rights, like the oil or coal, under someone else's ground, and you don't use them or even register them for 20 years, they expire. They go back to the surface owner.
So let's say I own a farm, but you own the oil underneath my farm. If you just completely ignore that oil for 2 full decades, you don't dig, you don't even file a piece of paper, I get it back.
That's the law. And so the people who lost their mineral rights sued. They said, the government took my mineral rights, I didn't do anything.
And the court said,
The court basically said, exactly, you didn't do anything, the government didn't take them from you, you abandoned them. The state is allowed to require you to do some basic paperwork to prove you still want your property. If you neglect it for 20 years and just ignore the rules, that's on you, not the state.
it's kind of like a statute of limitations. You can't just sleep on your rights forever.
Correct. Property ownership comes with at least a few responsibilities. And filing a form once every 20 years is considered a pretty reasonable responsibility.
Got it. Okay, so a quick recap of Section 2. these sneaky takings.
Let's do it.
First, you have a fundamental right to leave property to your kids, your heirs. That's HODL. The government can't just delete that right to save on paperwork. Second, if the government flies planes so low it ruins your house, that's a taking. That's Griggs. A physical invasion doesn't always mean someone touching the dirt.
Right. The air counts, too.
But third, if you just fail to fill out your paperwork for 20 years, you can lose your rights and get nothing. That's Texaco, and that's considered negligence, not theft by the government.
Spot on. Now, let's talk about something that has been in the news a lot more recently. This is a case that really, really gets people's blood boiling. Section 3, the taxman and equity theft.
I remember reading about this one. This is Tyler v. Hennepin County. This happened up in Minnesota just a couple of years ago, right?
It did. And it's a story that resonates because it involves a very vulnerable person. There was a 94-year-old woman named Geraldine Tyler. She owned a condo. She had to move into a senior community, and for a variety of reasons, she stopped paying her property taxes on the condo she owned.
Okay, and let's be clear. If you don't pay your taxes, the government can take your house. That's standard. Nobody is disputing that the government can collect the taxes it's owed.
Correct. The government has the right to seize the property to pay the debt. She owed about $15,000. That includes the back taxes, all the interest, and the penalties. So the county seized her condo and sold it at an auction. They sold it for $40,000.
Okay, let's do the simple math here. $40,000 sale price minus the $15,000 debt she owed. That leaves $25,000. That $25,000 should go back to Geraldine, right? It was her equity. It's her money.
That's what you would think. It's how a mortgage foreclosure works. If the bank sells your house, they take what they are owed and they have to give you back the rest.
So what did the county do?
Well, Minnesota had a forfeiture law that said if we seize property for taxes, we keep everything. The county kept the $15,000 she owed, and they kept the extra $25,000 for themselves.
They profited $25,000 off a 94-year-old grandmother's misfortune. That feels like state-sponsored theft.
It does. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, which is incredibly rare these days, said, absolutely not. That is a taking.
Unanimous. So the liberals and conservatives on the court all agreed on this.
Every single one. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. And he essentially said that the taxpayer must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but no more.
I like that.
The government is entitled to what it is owed. It is not entitled to the surplus. Your property rights, the equity you build up in your home, they don't just evaporate because you owe a debt. That equity is private property. If the government takes that cash surplus, they have to pay it back.
I love that ruling. It feels like common sense finally winning the day. It stops the government from treating its citizens like a piggy bank they can just break open.
It was a massive victory for property rights groups. It put a stop to what they were calling home equity theft in several states that had similar laws. It reaffirms that the government is a debt collector, not a pirate.
All right, recap for Section 3 is pretty simple. It's the Tyler Rule. If the government sells your house for back taxes, they can pay off the debt, but they cannot keep the change. The surplus belongs to you, the owner. Keeping it is an unconstitutional taking.
And now we arrive at Section 4. This is the big one. This is probably the most controversial property issue of the last, say, 20 years. Physical seizure and this idea of public use.
We've established that the government can take land for public use. And traditionally, we all think of a road, a school, a courthouse, public stuff that the public actually uses.
Right. If the government wants to take your land to build a fire station, nobody really argues about the public use part. You might argue about the price they offer you, but you agree a fire station is for the public. It serves the community directly.
What happens when the government takes your land just to give it to another private person?
And that brings us to Kelo v. City of New London. And this is where people get really, really angry.
Oh, yeah.
So the scene is New London, Connecticut in the late 90s. The city was really struggling economically. It was a dying industrial town.
I remember this story.
The city leadership comes up with this master plan to revitalize the city. They want to attract a major pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, to build a massive research facility right on the waterfront.
They thought Pfizer would be the savior. Bring in jobs, taxes, new restaurants would pop up, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. But to make that happen, they needed a huge chunk of land for the Pfizer plant itself and for a support area, new offices, parking, retail space. But that land wasn't empty. People lived there.
Suzette Kelo lived there.
Suzette Kelo lived there.
Yeah.
She had a cute little pink house. She had restored it herself. She loved her water view. and she did not want to sell.
And it wasn't a case of her holding out for more money. She just wanted to keep her home.
She just wanted to stay. But the city used eminent domain to take her house, not to build a school, not to build a road, but to give the land to a private developer. And that developer would then build the offices and shops that would, in theory, support the new Pfizer plant.
So Suzette Kelo sued, and her argument seems pretty straightforward. The Constitution says public use. A private developer making a profit is not public use, it's private use.
It seems like a slam dunk argument, doesn't it? But here is the massive twist. The Supreme Court disagreed with her. In a 5-4 decision, so very, very close, they ruled that public use essentially just means public purpose.
Public purpose. Okay, that sounds a lot broader. That sounds like a loophole you could drive a truck through.
It is much, much broader. The court said that economic development, so creating jobs, increasing tax revenue, revitalizing a blighted city, is a valid public purpose. And therefore, the government can take your private home and give it to a private developer, as long as there is some conceivable public purpose, like improving the local economy.
That's terrifying. It basically means if a new shopping mall can pay more in property taxes than my house does, my house isn't safe.
That was exactly the dissent's argument. Justice O'Connor wrote this scathing dissent. She said, and I'm quoting here, "The specter of condemnation hangs over all property. Nothing is to prevent the state from replacing any Motel 6 with a Ritz-Carlton, any home with a shopping mall, or any farm with a factory."
Because the Ritz-Carlton pays more taxes than the Motel 6.
That's the logic. If more taxes is the only justification you need, then the poor will always lose their property to the rich, because the rich can always promise to generate more tax revenue for the city.
So what happened to Suzette Kelo in the end?
She lost her house. They actually picked it up and moved it to another location, but she lost her land.
Yeah.
And here is the truly bitter irony of the whole story.
What's that?
Pfizer eventually merged with another company and pulled out of New London. The whole development plan fell through. For years, that land where her little pink house once stood remained an empty, weed-filled lot.
They destroyed an entire neighborhood for a promise that never even materialized.
Correct. It is widely considered one of the most unpopular Supreme Court decisions in modern history. The public outrage was so high that many states actually rushed to pass their own laws to ban this exact practice. But as far as the U.S. Constitution is concerned, Kelo is still the law of the land.
Wow. Okay. Let's recap Section 4, because that's a big one. Under the Kelo decision, public use is now defined very broadly to include economic development. So taking property from one private person to give to another private person is legal as long as the government thinks it might create jobs or more tax revenue.
Correct. Now let's pivot to Section 5. We're done with physical seizures for now. Now we're talking about regulatory takings.
Right. This is when the government doesn't take the deed to your land. They don't take the title. They just pass a law that messes up how you can use it.
Exactly. And this is much, much more common than eminent domain. Zoning laws, environmental protections, building codes, every city has them. The question is, when do these regulations go too far and become a taking that requires compensation?
And for this, we have a test, the Penn Central test.
Yes, named after the Grand Central Terminal in New York City, a beautiful, historic Beaux-Arts building. The owners wanted to build a giant 50-story office tower on top of the station.
That sounds aesthetically questionable, to put it mildly.
The city of New York agreed. They had a landmark preservation law, and they said, no, it's a historic landmark. You can't ruin the look of it. So the owners sued. They said, you took our air rights. We could have made millions renting out that office tower.
So the court had to come up with a test, a balancing act, because they couldn't say every regulation is a taking. If they did, you couldn't have any zoning laws at all.
Exactly. So they look at three main factors to decide if a regulation went too far. First, the economic impact. How much value did you actually lose? Did the regulation knock the value down by 10% or by 90%?
Okay, that's one.
Second, your expectations. Did the new law ruin your reasonable investment-backed expectations?
Yeah.
Meaning, did you buy the land specifically to build a factory and then a year later they banned all factories?
And what's the third one?
The character of the action. Is the government physically invading your space, or is it just adjusting the general rules for the common good?
So it's a very flexible, kind of mushy test. And honestly, looking at the history of these cases, the government usually wins Penn Central cases, right?
Overwhelmingly. It's very hard for a landowner to win a Penn Central case. But UT. There are two specific situations where the owner wins automatically. These are called per se takings. No balancing test required.
Automatic wins. I like the sound of those. What's the first one?
The first one is a permanent physical occupation. This comes from the Loretto case.
This one is kind of funny.
It is.
Yeah.
So New York passed a law that required landlords to let cable companies install these little cable boxes on their apartment buildings. The box was tiny. It was the size of a shoebox, bolted to the roof.
And it barely cost the landlord anything, if anything at all. But the landlord, Mrs. Loretto, she sued on principle.
And she won. The Supreme Court said it does not matter how small the intrusion is. It doesn't matter if it's just a sliver of space. If the government requires a third party, like the cable company, to permanently occupy even 1 square inch of your property, that is a taking. Full stop.
Get your box off my wall.
Exactly. You have the fundamental right to exclude everyone. If the government forces you to let a stranger put a box on your roof forever, they have to pay you for it.
Okay, so that's the first automatic win. What's the second?
The second is a total economic loss. This is the famous Lucas case. Mr. Lucas bought 2 beachfront lots in South Carolina. He paid almost $1 million for them. He planned to build 2 homes, one for his family and one to sell.
And then the state passed a new Coastal Zone Management Act.
It said, to protect against erosion, no permanent structures are allowed on the beach.
So overnight, his land value went from nearly $1 million to, basically zero.
Exactly. He couldn't build anything. He couldn't do anything with it. It was just $1 million patch of sand he could go visit.
And the court said this was a taking.
Yes. They created what's called the total takings rule. If a regulation renders your property economically idle, meaning it has zero productive use, the government has to pay you for it. It's the same as if they just stole the land. You can't leave a guy holding a worthless $1 million piece of dirt.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. What if the ban is just temporary? What if the government says, hey, hold on, no building for 2 years while we conduct a water study? Does that count?
An excellent question. You are thinking of the Tahoe Seor case. In that situation, there was a moratorium on building near Lake Tahoe. It lasted for 32 months.
So for almost 3 years, the owners couldn't do anything. They said for 32 months, our land was worthless. That's a taking.
But the court said no. A temporary ban is not a total loss because you get the value back when the ban lifts. The property still has future value. So the Lucas rule only applies if the economic loss is both permanent and total. The government needs time to think. They're allowed to hit the pause button without having to pay everybody.
Okay, that's a key distinction. Let's recap Section 5 on regulatory takings.
Good idea.
Usually we use the Penn Central balancing test, looking at impact, expectations, and character. It's a mushy test, and the government usually wins.
Right.
But if there is a permanent physical occupation, like that cable box, it's an automatic taking. That's Loretto.
And if there's a total and permanent economic loss, where the value goes to zero forever, that's also an automatic taking. That's Lucas. But temporary bans don't count.
Perfect. Now, Section 6. This is one of my favorite topics because it happens to regular people all the time when they're just trying to renovate their homes. This is the exaction.
I call this one the permit ransom.
That's a very, very accurate description. Here's the scenario. You want a building permit. Maybe you want to add a deck to your house, or you want to expand your store's parking lot. You go down to the city planning office, and they say, sure, we'll give you the permit, but what do you have to do something for us first?
Like, you have to give us part of your land for a public park, or you have to pay for a new bike path down the street.
Exactly. They are holding your permit hostage. The government is leveraging its power to grant permits to extract stuff from you that they would otherwise have to use eminent domain and pay for. The Supreme Court has set up some very strict rules for this in 2 famous cases, Nolan and Dolan. Nolan and Dolan. Sounds like a buddy cop movie. Let's start with Nolan. This is the essential nexus test.
So the Nolans owned a beachfront house in California. They wanted to tear down a small, rundown bungalow and build a bigger house. The California Coastal Commission said, okay, you can build, but only if you give the public a permanent easement to walk across your backyard to get from one public beach to another.
So the Nolans said, wait a minute, how does my new, bigger house hurt public access to the beach? I'm just making the house taller.
Exactly. And the court agreed with them. There must be a nexus, a logical link between what you were doing, the problem your project creates, and what they are asking for.
Okay.
Building a taller house might block the view of the beach from the street, but it doesn't stop people from walking on the beach. So demanding a walking path had no logical connection to the problem the house caused. It was just an excuse to grab some valuable beachfront land.
No link, no deal. That's the nexus test. Now, what about Dolan? The rough proportionality test.
Right. So Miss Dolan owned a hardware store. She wanted to expand it and pave her gravel parking lot. The city said, fine, but you have to dedicate a chunk of your land for public greenway and a bicycle path to help reduce traffic.
Okay, so wait, there is a link there? A nexus. A bigger store means more customers, which means more cars. A bike path helps with traffic, so it passes the Nolan Nexus test.
It does pass the nexus test, but the court said it failed the second test, rough proportionality. The city's demand was way too big for the problem. The impact of a slightly larger hardware store was pretty small, maybe a few extra cars a day.
And demanding a massive public greenway was
It
overkill.
was way out of proportion. The cost to the owner must be roughly proportional to the impact of their project. You can't demand $1 million park in exchange for a $1,000 driveway permit.
I see.
If the government wants a big public bike path that badly, they should pay for it with tax dollars. They can't force the hardware store owner to foot the entire bill just because she was unlucky enough to need a permit. In a more recent case, Kuntz said this applies even if they demand money instead of land.
So you can't say, give us $100,000 for the bike path fund.
Nope. The same rules apply.
Okay, recap Section 6. Exactions, the permit ransom. If the government holds your permit hostage, their demands must meet two tests.
Mhm.
1, nexus. The demand must be logically related to the problem your building creates. That's Nolan. You can't ask for a beach path to fix a view problem.
Right.
And 2, proportionality. The demand can't be way bigger than the impact of your project. That's Dolan. Don't ask for a highway to fix a driveway.
You've got it. Now, Section 7. Exceptions and compensation. We've talked a lot about when the government has to pay. Are there times when the government can destroy your stuff and pay you absolutely nothing?
I have a feeling the answer is unfortunately yes. The public peril exception. This Miller v. Skirm.
That's the one. The Cedar Tree case. This is a fascinating glimpse into how the state weighs different property values. So in Virginia, back in the 1920s, there was a fungus called cedar rust.
Okay.
It lived on cedar trees. It didn't really hurt the cedars, it just made them look a bit ugly.
Mm.
But if the wind blew the spores from the cedars onto a nearby apple tree, it ruined the apples.
And I'm guessing apple growing was a huge industry in Virginia. Big money.
Huge money. Cedars were mostly just decorative.
Mm.
Apples were a pillar of the state's economy. So the state passed a law ordering all cedar tree owners within a certain distance of an orchard to chop down their ornamental trees to save the apples. And they didn't pay the cedar owners a dime.
That feels really unfair. My tree is perfectly healthy. Why do I have to cut it down to save his business next door?
The court said this was valid. Faced with a choice between saving one class of property, the apples, which were vital to the economy, or another class, the cedars, which were just decorative, the state can choose to destroy one to save the other from a public peril. Because the cedars were acting as a host for a destructive disease, the state could order them removed without compensation. It's an emergency power.
It's like the trolley problem, but for trees. Kill the one to save the many.
A perfect analogy. Now, what about this idea of recharacterization? This comes from Webb's Fabulous Pharmacies.
The name alone is great.
It's a great concept. The government cannot just pass a law that says your private money is now our public money. In this case, there was a lawsuit, and the disputed money was sitting in a court bank account while the case was being settled. It sat there for a year, and that money earned interest.
And the court tried to keep the interest. They argued, hey, the account is ours, we manage it, so the interest is ours. It's like a service fee.
But the Supreme Court said no. The earnings of a fund are an incident of ownership of the fund. If the principal amount of money belongs to a private citizen, then the interest it earns also belongs to them. The state can't just relabel private interest as public fees. That is a taking.
So when they do have to pay, let's define just compensation. How much do they actually owe you?
The standard is fair market value. What a willing buyer would pay a willing seller on the open market at the time of the taking.
But here's the kicker, and it's a weird one that a lot of people miss. It's measured by the loss to the owner, not the benefit to the government.
Right. This is so crucial. If you own a swamp that is basically worthless to you, you can't build on it, you can't farm it, but the government needs that exact spot for a billion-dollar missile silo, they owe you the value of the worthless swamp, which is basically nothing, not the value of the silo.
And there was a very weird case about this, wasn't there? Brown v. Legal Foundation of Washington.
Yes. This involved client funds held by lawyers. Lawyers often hold client money for very short periods of time. The amounts were sometimes so small or held for such a short time that they couldn't possibly earn interest on their own. The bank fees to set up a separate account would cost more than the interest it would earn.
So the lawyers put all these tiny amounts from all their clients into one giant pooled account. And that giant account did earn a lot of interest. The state then took that interest and gave it to charities, specifically for legal aid for the poor.
And the clients sued. They said, hey, that's interest earned on my money. That's my property.
But the court said,
The court did a fascinating analysis and said, wait a minute. On your own, your small amount of money would have earned zero. In fact, after bank fees, you would have lost money. So your net loss is zero.
wow.
And since just compensation is based on the owner's loss, and the owner here lost nothing of realizable value, the compensation due is zero. Even though the government made money from the interest, the owner didn't actually lose any money they could have otherwise had.
That's a total brain twister. It is a taking, but the price tag is $0.
Exactly. So let's recap Section 7.
Go for it.
First, under the public peril doctrine, the government can destroy your property to stop a disaster, like a tree disease, without paying. That was Miller.
Okay.
Second, they can't just recharacterize your money as their money. The interest follows the principal. That's Webb's.
Right.
And third, compensation is fair market value based on your loss, not their gain. If you lost nothing of value, you get paid nothing. That's Brown.
We are in the home stretch now. Section 8. Prohibited legislation. These are laws the government is simply not allowed to pass, period. We're moving from property to just fairness.
First up, bills of attainder.
This sounds like something from medieval England. And it is. A bill of attainder is basically a legislative trial. It's when the legislature, like Congress, passes a law that declares a specific person or a specific group of people guilty of a crime and then punishes them, all without a judge or a jury.
So Congress can't just pass the John Smith is a crook act and then send John Smith straight to jail. Exactly. The founders hated this. Kings used to do it to get rid of their political enemies. In the U.S., it came up in a case called United States v. Lovett. Congress passed a law that specifically banned 3 named individuals from holding government jobs because they were suspected of being subversives.
They didn't give them a trial or anything. They just wrote their names into the law and said, you're fired and you can never work for us again.
And the court struck it down immediately. They said that preventing specific named people from working is a punishment. And you cannot punish people by statute. You need a trial. You need due process of law.
Okay, next up is ex post facto laws. This is the time travel rule.
After the fact.
Yeah.
You can't change the rules of the game after the game has already been played. A law is ex post facto and therefore unconstitutional if it does one of 3 things retroactively.
What are they?
1, it makes an act a crime that was perfectly illegal when you did it. 2, it increases the punishment for a crime after you've already committed it. Or 3, it takes away a defense you had when you committed the act.
That third one is really interesting. That's Stogner v. California, right?
Yes. California tried to extend the statute of limitations for certain sex abuse crimes. They tried to revive old cases where the time limit had already run out.
And the court said no.
It said no. Once that clock runs out, the defendant has a complete defense. You can't retroactively change the law to take that defense away and revive a dead prosecution. That is fundamentally unfair.
But, and this is a big but, this whole ex post facto thing only applies to criminal laws, not civil regulations.
A crucial distinction. This is the case of Smith v. Doe. Alaska passed a Megan's Law, a sex offender registry, and they applied it to people who were convicted before the law was even passed.
So the offenders sued. They said, hey, this is extra punishment. You're punishing us again years later. That's ex post facto.
But the court said no. The registry isn't punishment in the criminal sense. It's a civil regulatory scheme designed to protect public safety. Since it's not technically a crime and punishment law, the ban on ex post facto laws doesn't apply. They can apply these kinds of civil rules retroactively.
That is a really important distinction. Okay, finally, the obligation of contracts.
Right. The Constitution says states cannot pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. Basically, if you and I sign a contract, the state shouldn't be able to pass a new law next week that just tears that contract up.
What if the state tries to break its own contract? Like, say, a state issued bonds and promised to pay them back, but then says, you know what, we changed our mind.
Well, the courts are much, much stricter there. The state can't just break its own promises to save money. They can only get out of their own contracts if there is some kind of massive, unforeseeable crisis. They can't just say, whoops, we'd rather spend this money on something else now.
Got it. Okay, quick recap of Section 8. These prohibited laws.
Let's hear it.
1. Bill of Attainder. The legislature cannot act like a court and declare specific people guilty and punish them. That's love it.
Right.
2, ex post facto, you can't retroactively criminalize behavior or increase punishment. But, and this is key, this only applies to criminal laws, not civil registries like in Smith v. Doe. And 3, contracts. States can't easily mess with private contracts, and they really can't mess with their own contracts unless it's a massive emergency.
We have covered a massive amount of ground.
We really have. So let's bring it all home. A final grand recap of everything.
Okay. First, on property itself. It's a bundle of sticks. If you don't own the stick, you can't sue when it's taken.
Next, takings. The government can take your property for public use, and Kelo reminds us that public use is a very broad term, but they must pay you fair market value.
Right. Then regulations. If a law wipes out 100% of your property's value forever, like in Lucas, or if it physically invades your land, like in Loretto, it's a taking. Everything else is that mushy Penn Central Balancing Act.
And exactions. If the city wants a permit ransom, their demand must be related to the problem. That's the nexus. And the size of the demand has to be fair. That's the proportionality.
And finally, those unfair laws. No bills of attainder and no retroactive criminal laws.
So why does all of this matter? I mean, at the end of the day, it's because these rules are the only thing standing between you and the state deciding that they have a better use for your living room than you do.
It connects right back to that idea of security we started with. A free society, a functioning economy. It all relies on the basic idea that if you work for something and you buy something, it stays yours. These court cases are the constant fine-tuning of that fundamental promise.
And here's a final provocative thought to leave you with. We talked about Kelo, the case where the city took Suzette Kelo's home to give to a private developer, all in the name of getting more tax revenue. That is still the law of the land today.
It is.
So if public use can just mean better tax revenue, ask yourself this. Is any property truly safe? Or is your house only really yours until someone richer comes along who can promise to pay the city higher taxes than you do?
That is the lingering, unresolved question of modern property law.
Something to think about next time you pay your mortgage. Thanks for diving in with us today.
Stay curious.
See you next time.